In this session, we're going to be looking at the history of learning with technology. So we're going to go right back to the Roman times and before and have a look at the different types of technology that have been used for learning. And then we're going to take it right up to where we are today and see if we can explain some of the trends that we're seeing at the moment. For a long period of time, we didn't see much change in the way education worked for children. So children from rich families were given the chance to get a strong education. Those from poorer ones had less chance there. Military service was a very good way of ensuring that you had some sort of practical approach to serving your country and taught obviously practical skills. And then there were apprenticeships which ran in families or family type units in the ancient times. Not much had changed by the time we got to medieval times. Children from rich families were still given the chance to receive a strong education, those from poorer families less so. But we did see the beginning of the first universities in Western Europe. Military service still teaching practical skills, and apprenticeships had changed a slight amount, now contracted and related to guilds, where guilds basically gave the quality control of apprenticeships. The level of technology used in universities at the time, from 11th to the 15th centuries, was typically quite basic, relying a lot on memory skills, oral skills, where you would communicate your knowledge of texts and demonstrate your intellectual skills through that approach there. Engaging with written text was very difficult, essentially because all the texts had to be handwritten, often in the hands of monks or other learned or isolated people. So there weren't multiple copies of any particular textbooks in those days. Encouragement for students, often quite medieval you could say, based around punishment, often humiliation. The giant wooden spoon, the idea of getting a wooden spoon for coming last, came from this time, where the person who was the worst in the class would receive a giant wooden spoon to demonstrate how ineffective they were in their field. Nonetheless, there's a lot of memory skills for the students there, which were quite admirable and certainly, given the situations they were in, absolutely necessary. When I asked the class what has been the technology that's had the biggest impact on the world, I got 10 responses. 7 of those said the internet, one person said the PC, another person said fire, another person mentioned a number of things, all of which quite legitimate. Language, not necessarily a technology, but certainly absolutely massive impact. The wheel, internal combustion engine, and antibiotics and vaccination, all very, very meritorious. I'm going to go with something a bit different from all of those, but we will come back to some of them. So I'm choosing the printing press. Essentially because of the impact that it made on medieval Europe. So before the printing press, which there's multiple iterations of the printing press. There's something that was done in China, various things that were done in Europe. But we're going to say around about 1440 for the development of the printing press. Before that time, there were maybe 30,000 books in Europe just before then. In the 40 years following the introduction of that press, 20 million books existed, with 20,000 different titles. Currently, there are 129 million titles in existence. That's in 2010, according to Google Books, and quite a significant number. And certainly the impact that it had on education was profound. If we look at the number of books at Cambridge University by year as a measure of the growth of books around the world, we see that there's an exponential growth going on there, ranging from 1600 to 1950, where a lot of the records are not so clear anymore in terms of the fact that it's not necessarily an accumulation of books, but it becomes an ability to actually store all the books that you want to have. So different repositories existed for books after that time. But as we can see, there is actually what's a legitimate exponential growth happening for the number of books. And if we take that as representative of what's happening around the world at those times, we can see that there's really, really significant changes happening there. Before the printing press, a ban was offered an entire village for a particular book that existed, handwritten by whoever had written it. And that offer was actually refused. So before the printing press, you could see that a book was worth more than a village. Afterwards, significantly less so. The church was a significant partaker in the printing press. They used that to distribute Bible-related materials, religious materials. But universities also basically took a massive advantage of that. All of a sudden, books which were so rare and could rarely be lent out were now becoming much more common, and the nature of universities changed quite significantly from that point. The idea of memorizing content, having to regurgitate it to demonstrate your knowledge, no longer really mattered because the book changed the fact that the access to information was much, much easier. In some ways, you could say that the printing press was the beginning of growth of equity around the population. So beforehand, we had a growing but illiterate population. The existence of textbooks, the possibility of getting hold of a book that might teach you how to read and write was very, very powerful. Eventually, schools grew, it became compulsory around about the late 19th century. If you think about it, we're looking at fairly late growth in that sort of space where schools were compulsory. Late 18th, 19th century, we're only looking at something like 150 years ago.